not sure how you pronounce your last name.
Cecil.
Cecil. And, well, we are very, very honored that you are here, that you came to Curacao, and that you are going to deliver this lecture, and we are all very curious as to what you are going to tell us.
Me too.
So, okay, let's listen to us.
Thank you.
You put it in here. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for coming out. I appreciate it. Also to our superlative hosts, Alex and Gwen, who are just being wonderful in every way. And to Bloemhof for hosting us on such short notice, and for all of you for coming out. I really appreciate it. So thank you for coming out this evening. There's an old joke that goes, what do you call someone who speaks 3 languages? Trilingual. What do you call someone who speaks 2 languages? Bilingual. What do you call someone who speaks 1 language? American. This is the story. There's another story from America. It's probably apocryphal, but it's ascribed to a governor from Texas in the 1930s, and they were arguing about what languages should be taught in schools. And she said, the first female governor of Texas, by the way, and she said, well, if English is good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for the school children of Texas. And I think I wanted to start there because I come from the land of aggressive monolingualism. America stands for money and monolingualism. We will not speak more than 1 language because we know that ruins your mind, denigrates your country, destroys everything about the American way of life, apparently. So incredibly diverse, but somehow we don't know that. It's just this strange magic effect in America, but it's an aggressive cultural policy that's been in place for several hundred years to try to press down all of the other languages that are spoken, which are immense diversity, and pretend like everybody who's there, even if you just arrived last month from Indonesia, speaks English, right? Like, of course you would, because everybody in the world speaks English, like Jesus. So this concept is very heavily rooted. And so I come here to speak in Curacao, and you're involved in what I understand is something of a controversy, but you have Spanish and English. I'm speaking in English, and you have Dutch, you have Papamento, which is an amazing mix of both the Spanish and Portuguese tradition, plus a lot of other influences. Not, by the way, often not mentioned, but several of the constructions, I would argue, are probably taken from West Africa. There are several constructions that are really the West African language tradition, influencing sort of like the passiveness constructions that's very common in several West African languages that you also get in Papamento. So this rich, diverse, this crossroads of the world. And so I know there's a discussion and a debate going on, but from somebody from America who loves languages, it sounds like listening to people say, well, should we take the Mercedes or the BMW to dinner tonight? It's sort of an argument, but it's an argument that comes from such a place of cultural richness and diversity and amazing capacity that I guess it's serious, but I have a hard time like, wow, that's such a great debate to be having. I wish we could have that debate in America, but we just won't, right? We're absolutely not going to do it. So when you come from the land of aggressive, monolingual, English-speaking Jesus, this is like a paradise. This is like such an embarrassment of linguistic and cultural riches that it's just, it's almost overwhelming. It's wonderful and it's great. So that's basically what I have to say. So in more particular detail, I think what we forget is that when we're involved in so many languages, is that language serves a lot of purposes. It's not one thing. And so you can look at all kinds of different linguistic traditions, and one, that may surprise people, is like in ancient Japanese. So in the 19th century, Japan had the Meiji Restoration. They were forcibly being opened to the West. They got rid of the old shogunate, and they created a new government, which they called the Meiji government, which is complete creation. It was a historical fiction, but they called it the Meiji Restoration. And they thought, wow, we don't know how modern governments work in the West because we have very limited contact. The only real contact that they had had for hundreds of years was with a very small Dutch trading colony. And so they sent Japanese scholars to Holland to learn like parliamentary law and taxation systems. And so there's this bizarre set of Japanese vocabulary, which is their attempt to translate into Japanese the parliamentary and democratic systems of Holland that had developed over hundreds of years, right? So that was an ongoing process, and they had no words for it. And so there's this so they're creating all these, like they're combining like the word for, I think they took wheelbarrow and village, and that was like parliament, right? Like they're trying to stick these words together that they had to kind of come up with some concept of what it is these people are talking about. And so one thing that you get in every language is these deep histories and the changes and the diversity and the origins that carry so much meaning over time. And so when you go back and study them and you see the origins and diversity and where it is today and where it might be going, it's not just a story of a language, it's a story of cultures, and in the case of Papiamento, many cultures. Like this crossroads of the world. People think, oh, Curacao is this small island out in the middle of nowhere. Linguistically, it's a huge island in the middle of everything, right? And that's what's extraordinary. So much diversity has been maintained in such a small space. It's really quite stunning. A contrary example, the opposite of this, does anybody know the author Ahmet Pamuk, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature a while ago, a Turkish author? And he writes about this because Kemal Ataturk modernized Turkey, and in the process of doing that, he decided, well, the Old Turkic language was no good. Now, the Old Turkic language had roots to Old Persian, which means it went back for millennia. One of the great literary traditions in the world. I mean, it's just phenomenal. And he said, well, we don't want that. We're going to make a modern Turkish language. It had no literature. And so Ahmet Pamuk grew up, and he said, like, being a writer in Turkey was like sort of playing with model trains. It's not like people didn't think it was a crime or that it was a problem, but they didn't understand what you could possibly be doing because there was no literature or almost no literature. And so when he won the Nobel Prize, it was this huge moment because it's like, oh, we're starting to get a literature back. That we got cut off from our past, and now here we're starting to make an impact. But it took a while, and so it's this, so when you cut that past off, you destroy a lot. I mean, you really lose an immense amount. And so if you compare something like Japanese that has this strange rolling history for thousands of years, or at least probably 1,000 years, say from, if you call Heian Japan sort of the origins of modern Japanese. Oh, by the way, modern Japanese people can't read Japanese from that period. So like Junichiro Tanizaki, also won the Nobel Prize for Literature, one of the things he was famous for in Japan was translating their great epic, The Tale of the Genji, into modern Japanese, so that Japanese people could read it. So, languages never stop. When you think about people translating works in their own language into the modern language, you realize, wow, these are dynamic, ongoing, changing systems, particularly in a country like Japan, which is notorious for trying to seal itself off. It's still experiencing these dynamic linguistic changes and evolutions. So one thing you get is in languages are these deep, deep histories that you can read out of them. You also get access to worlds. And I think this is easier to understand if you take it out of what are called the natural languages, and you think about, why would we teach a student to read music? If you can read music, it gives you access to a whole world that if you can't read music, you don't have access to. If you learn to read, or you learn to do math, right? Learning math is a way of opening a world to you. It's an infinite world. Nobody knows all the math. It just goes on and on and on and on. But it opens this whole world of possibility. Things you can study, things you can understand, things you can create that otherwise would not be available to you. In fact, there's a whole series of books. Probably the most famous one is called The Dancing Wu Li Master. And they say, ancient Taoism and modern quantum physics have a lot in common. And this is because no one can translate ancient Chinese, and no one knows how to do the math for quantum mechanics. And so they just pretend like these things which nobody can access are the same. They aren't the same in any way. It's hilarious. They're hilariously not the same. But if you don't have access to either the quantum mechanics or the ancient Chinese, you don't know that. And nobody has access to everything. Of course, unfortunately, we're finite beings in this world of unbelievable riches, unbelievable opportunities. And so every time you learn a language, whether it's math or another language, a foreign language, or you improve your own language, your world expands and grows. And so one thing that's always needs to be pondered and reflected on is like, oh, what worlds can I open for myself? What world do I want to open for my children? What kind of past do I want them to be able to access? What kind of future? So it's this very dynamic thing. So it helps with this deep past. It gives you access to worlds. Like I always want to learn Persian, but the alphabet, I cannot read the alphabet. It's crazy, the alphabet. I just can't get it. And so I just finally gave up on that one. But because that's such a rich, beautiful, beautiful world. And some people don't know it. For instance, when the Mongols invaded China, everybody knows that, they were Persian speaking. So it had this big influence on the culture of China. Just as like everybody has seen the Greek statue, or not the Greek statue, seen the statues of the Buddha with the robes on, those are Greek robes. So when Alexander the Great marched roughly to India-ish, it's influenced the art, because of Greek art, of Buddha at that time. And so all the Buddhas before that looked completely different. And then all of a sudden he got a toga. It's a toga. I mean, he got like the Greek, sort of robe. And all of a sudden Buddha shows up like he's been carved by a Greek statue maker from, several thousand miles away. And so there's just these great moments in cultural history of sharing and growth and, sort of interpenetration. So you get, again, deep history, the worlds that become available to you, identity, right? Oh, identity is so huge with language. Who you can talk to, how can you speak with them, what kinds of things can you share, and how do you share them, and who gets to speak, right? These are one of those amazing things that we often overlook, right? If you're in an environment where you can't speak the language, then your voice in many instances is sort of taken from you, right? And so when we give people access to a language, when we keep a language alive and breathing and vibrating, what we're literally doing is allowing those people to have a voice. And one of the things you see in America all the time, because again, aggressively monolingual, is these vestigial communities of often people who have immigrated at, say, 50 or 60. And they never really learned English, but everybody else, their children, learns English, and everyone around them knows English, and so they kind of have these small, often very sad communities where the language is slowly dying with them. And I've always thought this is just criminal, right? Those languages should be flourishing with them. Those communities should be learning those languages from them to help spread them and keep them alive, but we will not do that, right? In America, we're going to have none of that. And so this deep cultural root, like, can I speak to my grandmother in her language? Will my grandmother be able to speak to her great-grandchildren in her language? Think about that connection, right? That to be able to pass on from generation to generation to generation, the stories, the accents, the feels, the words that just don't exist in other languages for whatever is vital and important to you. And so there is also this, incredibly important cultural tradition that allows identities to be formed and maintained, over long periods of time. And so, again, opening up worlds, having opportunities to carry on cultural traditions and maintain identity, the capacity to access deep history, and then the notion of the vast literatures of the world. So we're unbelievably fortunate that the world is filled with spectacular translators. This has not always been the case. And so for the first time in the last 100 years or so, the literatures and the ideas and the concepts of the world are being made available to the world. So you can read the Epic of Gilgamesh because somehow some really brilliant people were able to translate cuneiform tablets, a language that had been lost. Well, there are many languages that are written in cuneiform alphabet, but the one that Epic of Gilgamesh was in had been lost for 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years. And they got the tablets and they were able to finally work it out. And so we get something like the Epic of Gilgamesh, oral story, then written down, but from probably 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. And when you read it, you go, whoa, 5,000 years ago, they were experiencing things that I can identify with across this vast gulf. But then there's whole parts of it that I can't. There are still sections where the translators go, we know what the word is, but we don't know what it means really anymore, because the cultural the living tradition of the language has been lost. And around the world today, languages are one of the most endangered things. There are so many small languages that are under threat because they are overwhelmed by English, or they're over. China is very aggressive about stomping out languages. English just ignores everybody. China is actually aggressive about it. There's economic impulses to well, you don't want to spend time learning that language. By the way, America is so bad at this, just popped in my mind, that when 9/11 happened, it turns out that there was no station chief of the CIA anywhere in the world that spoke the language of the country they were stationed in. And what they found out was if you took time off in the CIA to learn a language, it killed your career. Because while you were spending 2 or 3 years wasting your time trying to understand another culture, your compatriots were getting promoted, making more money, and so we had literally no Arabic-speaking senior officials at all, which is insane, if for no other reason than the fact that Arabic is an amazingly wonderful language filled with art and history and literature and poetry and lots of, we have problems. So you think at least for the most base reasons you would learn Arabic, but if not for the most beautiful, but we won't have it, right? Just, it kills your career. You learned Arabic, well, no promotion for you because you weren't doing the right things. So it's just crazy. So, but when we're in this world of all these pressures of languages, it does become vexed. Like, how do we protect and save these smaller languages? What's the best way? And so a couple of things that have come out, where I live in the Pacific Northwest, there's the Salish Sea tribal languages, and there's a whole bunch of them. And the biggest local group is the Macaws. And the Macaws are a group of Native Americans who were never conquered. So they were never taken, they never signed a treaty that was under threat. They've had the land continuously. If you go visit their nation, there's a big sign that says, hey, leaving America, you're on Macaw land now. Right? We were never conquered. This is our business. We'll tell you what to do. Right? And part of that, though, is trying to keep the Macaw language alive. And it's really difficult, even in this environment where they were actually never physically conquered. But culturally, the pressure is so immense. Even though they're about as remote as you can get in the continental United States, they're still under this immense pressure. And plus, it's a really difficult language, by the way. People think, oh, primitive peoples have these easy languages. No, this is nonsense. Primitive people have unbelievably complex languages quite often. The Macaw being amongst them. Not that they were even primitive, by the way. They did amazing art, literature, and poetry, and everything else. But you're like, wow, this is really a tough language. But they're taking big efforts to maintain it. But it's one of the last Salish, but there's a whole group of languages that were in our area. And you see it all over the world. My favorite example of this is modern day Farsi, which is what they speak in Iran. And it's a version of Persian, is what it is. So but the Persian language was being destroyed, culturally kind of conquered by Arabic because of Islam, et cetera, et cetera. And a single poet, Firdusi, wanted to save the language. And so he wrote this epic called the Shahnameh of Firdusi that was so popular that it effectively saved Persian from being conquered by Arabic. And so to this day, it's a clear dividing line in the Islamic world where Firdusi's poem sort of put up the ramparts and said, no further. We got 800 million Arabic speakers, that's enough. We're going to save some of the Persian speakers over here. And that's that. And it maintained that. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but not much. That a single work of her literature was so powerful and so amazing that it sort of really did sort of defend the Persian language and keep it rolling. And it is, by the way, if you've never read it, it is a crazy, amazing work. But it's impossible to translate Persian poetry. It's really hard. A lot of it's lost, of course, as often happens in translation. But it is a wonderful, wonderful work. And even today, Iranians tend to name their children from characters from this epic. It's a very common, like, you go to the epic to find a name for your son or your daughter. Much the way the Ramayana and the Mahabharata function for the Hindu tradition in India. So, one aspect of keeping a language alive is maintaining its literary vibrancy, right? Is creating new works, bringing works into the language. I just spoke with somebody who does this, translates into Papandu, which is amazing and wonderful, and creating new works that often then get translated and people go like Amud Pamuk. No one is reading Turkish because that's right. Even the Turkish people didn't think they had the literature, right? And so all of a sudden Amud Pamuk shows up and like, oh wow, this is incredible. Maybe we do have a right. It's this driving force of music, poetry. Think of the influence and impact that someone like Bob Marley had on Jamaican culture, right? His one guy with a band ends up sort of having this immense cultural impact by spreading his art, his beauty, his belief. And that resonates, literally all over the world, extraordinary degree. And so this notion of keeping things alive by keeping them vibrant and active. The analogy, my wife grows seeds, flower seeds, so I always like seed metaphor. So all over the world there's seed banks where they sort of put seeds in vaults and try to protect them. And this is not necessarily a bad idea because if everything goes wrong, it would be nice to have a vault of seeds that are protected. But clearly the better way, the more vibrant way, is to have lots of people planting those seeds over and over and over again. If there's a greater diversity of seeds in the world, then we're more secure in our food crops, in our flower crops, in just the ecological diversity that we have. And it's exactly the same with languages. The more people that speak more languages, the more diverse, the more opportunity, the more beauty is available to everybody in the world, and then the more cross-pollination that comes into it. And so these sorts of ways of reflecting on it. That's why I say I don't see it so much as a conflict as a great discussion that can be had about, we have this, how do we maintain this phenomenal richness that has been bequeathed to us by our forebears? We can't pay them back because someone gives you something as beautiful as Papiamento or Spanish or Dutch. You can't pay that back. It's an impossibly huge gift. But you can sort of participate in helping keep it alive and helping keep it to breathe meaning into it. So that it's not a mechanical thing, but it's a thing of love and joy that you share with people and invite people in. This is another thing that happens. It happens a lot in philosophy and a lot of academic subjects. They like to make walls that then you have to get over to get inside. Because then the people on the inside, oh, we're special. And you on the outside, well, you're kind of dumb and you don't know, and all this kind of stuff, which I just hate that with every fiber of my being, as opposed to saying, here's something beautiful, I didn't create it, but I get to participate in it. Would you like to participate in it too? Wouldn't that be fun? And maybe you don't, right? Maybe we don't want to learn quantum physics. The math is hard, let's be clear, right? But somebody does. Why create a wall? I might say, hey, please, come open our hearts, open our minds. Let's share this. Let's participate together. And those approaches that allow the cultural tradition to survive and thrive and grow because of open-heartedness, and lets the cross-pollination feed out and influence the greater world. So that, I think about the future and I go, one future which a lot of people push for, by the way, this is not me, this is if you read technology people and all that, they're like, oh, there's too many languages, it's just too hard to translate them, it slows everything down, we have to write instructions in all these languages nobody speaks, which I always think is funny. Who gets to decide that nobody speaks a language, right? It's inconvenient for me, therefore nobody speaks this language. It's like, well, I'm not sure that's the same thing. And so they just say, let's make this efficient and get rid of all the other languages. right? We'll just battle it out between like Chinese and English and maybe Spanish, which seems sort of inhuman and insane. But the flip side is to say, no, let's just make as much available to as many people in as many ways as possible. To wit, one thing that's been happening actually, so the typewriter killed a lot of languages because they don't work on a typewriter. A typewriter was designed for the Roman languages, the Romance basically. If you have the alphabet, like we have in English and Spanish and Pamento, you could use a typewriter. If you don't, you can't. And so a lot of languages, Persian, Chinese, Japanese, struggle, Hungarian, with the standard typewriter because it's not a good mechanism for them. Modern technology allows like calligraphy. You can do calligraphy again and scanning. And so calligraphic languages, of which there are many, and of which is a beautiful art form, you're not just writing words, you're making a piece of art word by word by word. I mean, that is astounding. This is what Chinese character, the old poet masters used to do. Every character was a painting that added up to a poem. You can't do that in English. English does not have that. If you have a calligraphic language like Chinese or like ancient Persian, then you can. Now with scanning technology, these languages are coming back. It's much easier to keep those traditions alive and for them to flourish. And so these sorts of opportunities that are now, I think, everywhere, technology can kill this diversity or it can help make it flourish. I'm obviously for the flourish. So as we think about or explore the possibilities of language, those are the four things I'd like you to keep in mind, is that it serves at least four, and probably more than, I'm sure I'm forgetting major ones, and later I'll go, oh my gosh, I've done. But one is the deep history. And that is available in every language, and where it comes from, and who's been influencing, and where those influences came from, and why does this word exist. Ketchup is an English word that comes from Malagasy. I love that. It's the only English word I think that we took from Malagasy. But hey, there you go. We'll take it, right? But it just meant at some point we were dealing there. We had this interaction with them. This word came into English. Deep history, and then access to worlds. Right, that the languages give you, and again, not just the natural languages, all languages give you the possibility to explore new, expand your mind, expand your horizons. Culture, right? This is a way of maintaining our connections with our past and carrying them on into the future and thinking about that they're worthwhile, worth investing in, like a garden, worth tending. Let's make the soil rich, put more fertilizer in so that more flowers can bloom. And then this notion of what kind of future do we want? Right? How do we, in the future, do we want 1,000 languages or 2? Right? I mean, that's really fundamentally the question. And all over the world, small languages are threatened. And no one can exactly agree on what the best way to defend them are, but I think really a good place to start is to A, learn languages, and B, to be open and invite people to learn, and to encourage people to expand out. Like I said, too often people want to create barriers of who gets to speak, and they have to speak it perfectly. Like the French are notorious for this, right? Like you try to learn French, and often, particularly apparently in Paris, they just mock you hopelessly. So this is bad French arrogance, because how perfect do you have to be before they'll let you speak French, right? This is a horrible way to keep your language alive. This is not, but they don't have to worry so much because so far they've been doing all right. But at some point, if French language started to suddenly fall in popularity, they would probably have to change that. They would probably have to start saying, "Oh, we appreciate that very much that you bothered to even try to learn. Let's encourage that a little bit more." Right? So there's this very curious tensions that are there all the time. But it seems that invitation and tending and investment in growing, not locking in vaults, but in planting and growing and tending is really the arc that I would encourage for all languages, any language. And so that's basically my reflection on this. I mean, you can talk about technical grammar things and all of the amazing, unique aspects of Papiamento, which I've been studying, of course, before I came to this lecture, and just the amount of linguistic diversity that has been incorporated so quickly into such a small space I can't really think of a close analogy with other languages. It really is quite extraordinary, the amount of cultural lift that happened, and what that meant for the people crossing, lots of input, but also people being stable. Because if you just have lots of input and people moving around all the time, you don't have a chance to develop. So you have both lots of input and lots of cultural stability and intercommunication, which is relatively rare, particularly in an environment where you have so many other, Spanish is 30 miles that way, and Portuguese not that much further, and English everywhere, of course, and just the Dutch, of course, from the historical context. And these sorts of concepts are just so vital for remembering when you start exploring this and thinking about it. And finally, and then speaking of the Dutch, this is the other one to think about, because Dutch is not a huge language in the world, of course. So it's like, what? Why learn Dutch, right? It's not English, it's not Spanish. And, why learn Papiamento, right? Same question. It's not English, it's not Spanish. What's the point? What's not Chinese, or there's not a billion speakers. One deep history again. It's the deep cultural history of this strange place. Every place is strange. And the shared history and the deep connections to the rest of the world. Like I said, the Japanese. Some Japanese scholars have to learn Dutch because they want to learn their political history. And weirdly enough, it comes from, right? So all of these elements. And I always think, wow, this could be one very small and one, relatively small European language, like keeping each other alive, right? Carrying each other forward together, which would be sort of extraordinary. It would be like this kind of English, Chinese, right? Spanish, we don't need you. We've got two perfectly spectacular languages, plus Spanish, plus Portuguese, plus everything else. But it's that sort of extraordinary idea of keeping the richness and the diversity alive. And so, just to wrap up, I guess I would say, don't be America. Not that you're any threat of doing that, because this is just this aggressive monolingualism, which makes no sense in a country. I think we're the second largest Spanish-speaking country in the world is the United States. We have lots of Spanish speakers, massive numbers, and yet we pretend like Spanish doesn't exist. That's our operating principle in the United States. Even in a place like, again, to return to my original joke, Texas, which of course had a lot of Spanish speakers in there when it was conquered by the United States. And it was like, hey, why are you guys speaking Spanish? They're like, well, we've been speaking Spanish for like 300 years. Why are you guys speaking English? Right? And yet we pretend like, poof, that's not a thing. Speak English like Jesus. That's the plan. So just some thoughts for you this evening on the great, wonderful cultural riches that you are so fortunate to be the inheritors of. And I hope the thoughtful and loving guardians of as we go forward. Thank you very much.